Hey everybody, I'm Sammy Lane. I'm the Director of Technology Strategy at Okta, and something's been bugging me, so I decided to do a quick video about it, and that's the authentication and how we perceive risk in the industry of cybersecurity. And one of the best ways to look at that is to look at the actual threats that we see leading to breaches, and then compare that to what we're actually investing in. So let's take a quick look at that. I want to look at the changing threat landscape by looking at the latest Verizon data investigation breach report. In the latest one, they had an interesting comparison on how the change of the threats has progressed over the last 5 years. So they looked at 2013, what were the threat actions and the actual asset categories that led to breaches. So let's start with the threat actions. In 2013, unsurprisingly, hacking was the leading action that led to breaches, 56%. Followed by malware at 30% and social attacks at 17%. Now, when you zoom forward to 2018, you would think that malware has taken off even further, but that's actually not the case. Hacking went down a little bit, malware went down slightly, but social attacks skyrocketed 18 percentage points to 35%, bypassing malware as the actual action that led to breaches. And correspondingly, if you look at the asset categories that were being targeted, servers was the primary category back in 2013 at 65% targeting servers. Of course, that's where the data is, right? End user's device was 28%, and the person themselves was 19%. Now, skip forward to 2018, and interestingly, servers are still, of course, at number one. User's device didn't jump up as much. You would think that targeting the endpoint is becoming more prevalent as more defenses are being put around the server infrastructure, but that didn't materialize here. Instead, the person became the primary target here in a 20 percentage point jump from the 2013 data. Now, 39% of the breaches were targeting directly the individual person, not the server or the user's device. Now, if you look at the data from 2017, where you could break it down in a little bit of different axes, something interesting comes out. I color-coded it here in blue and green. Blue are the ones that are like primarily about the credential of the user, and green is everything else. Everybody in the news is always looking at the new fancy ransomware and vulnerabilities, etc. Of course, vulnerabilities are, proliferating. There are more and more of them. But exploiting these vulnerabilities led to 6 breaches directly, whereas 653 of those were because of good old-fashioned phishing. Why is that? It's because identity and security are now that intersection where everything comes together. Why would you waste your time targeting a server and hacking into it when you can simply log in by compromising the end user and getting their credential? So it used to be that IT was delivered by racking and stacking servers and deploying those apps, in the data center. But today, everything's going in the cloud. And if you look at the security model, the people in the middle are outside now mostly of those perimeters. The traditional perimeter where you had your data center and firewalls and IDS and IPS and sharks with lasers in your moat, those users are no longer inside that perimeter. And increasingly, your workloads and the servers and systems aren't either. Now, if you're using SaaS services, of course, they never were. They were always in the cloud, and user went directly to them. You had no visibility. But now, even your traditional applications and users are escaping that perimeter. Your cloud transforming your applications, and the users are outside of your perimeter, taking a vacation from their desks down at the Starbucks down the street, or more likely seeing customers, doing the job, but not at their desk. So you no longer have the traditional perimeter. Instead, you could think about your user's identity, the authentication authorization. Auth-N and Auth-C is the new perimeter. So what does it mean? If you look at the workforce, now you have all these applications that you're deploying. Some of them are still on-premise for the foreseeable future. Others are in the cloud, and you need to tie these together. Your customers are coming to you, and you're serving them increasingly through more and more applications, more and more ways of them to get the service, and they want that uniform omni-channel experience where they have one identity, one authentication, one authorization. Now, in the past, it used to be that this identity that you got was part of the software stack. It came from Oracle or IBM or Microsoft. But today, identity is really that integration layer that ties those traditional silos together with the modern cloud-oriented apps and platforms like IaaS and PaaS platforms. And it's really becoming that universal platform. If you look at the actual landscape, it's not just the users and their identities into cloud and on-prem apps, but it's other organizations that you're communicating with and the identities of those users and the systems that you're communicating with through APIs, Internet of Things, and the end users' computing devices. You need to start thinking about how do you handle the authentication, authorization of all those assets that ultimately access your data. And it gets even worse. If you think about that like customer identity, it used to be simple. You just build a website and through a database and put some usernames and passwords in that database and call it good. But now identity really is a microservice. If you think about it, any application that your business unit or developer builds, some of those applications might need things like payment, and you wouldn't let your developers build a payment gateway. You plug in something like Stripe or PayPal or whatever. Same thing with communications. You wouldn't let them build an SMS gateway or some fancy communications platform. You plug in something like Twilio. Now, almost every application needs identity. And you should think of identity in the same way as you think about these other things. Think of it as a microservice that allows you to build an application so that your users have an authentication authorization source of truth in one place, because it yields security dividends that I'll come to in a second. I mean, in that sense, identity is that universal platform that allows you to tie these platforms together and deploy anywhere. Because from the security stack perspective, it used to be that network was the perimeter. You had your firewalls and VPNs. Today, the people are the perimeter. It's identity-driven security that's the new normal. And we're taking that towards the full zero trust model where there is no traditional perimeter at all. Instead, you're measuring each authentication authorization event on its own merit. You need to take the full context of the request into account. So, what does that look like then? Let's talk about the attacks that you're trying to then defend against. Because if the leading cause of breaches is identity attacks, I want to categorize those attacks a little bit. So broadly, you could have like identity creation attacks where you're creating a synthetic identity or doing identity theft. You're creating the account with fake credentials. Then you have the identity takeover attack where an established identity has been given to somebody who's accessing your systems. And then you're dealing with credential theft or credential stuffing, password spraying, or brute force attacks. And some of these can also lead to like identity lockouts and kind of like identity layer denial of service as well. I wanted to focus here on the takeover part for 1 sec. So credential theft is the obvious first thing. How does it work? Phishing. Everybody knows how this works. You send a link to the site, get the credentials, use them later. Now, this still works today amazingly well, as you saw from the statistics, because MFA that is being deployed is weak or is inconsistent. And of course, people reuse the passwords everywhere. The lack of security awareness is everywhere. And I'll come back to what can we actually do about it. You can shame the users or you can do something that helps. Next step is the credential stuffing. This is where you get a credential from a password dump or a data breach dump, and then you just automate the testing of those credentials across a lot of different sites. If this username and password work here, let me try it at other popular sites and see if this user happen to have the same username, which is more and more the case because email addresses are the default username now. And of course, if they had the same password everywhere, your odds of unlocking one of those accounts is pretty good. This still works for the same exact reasons. People are reusing the passwords. There's often no MFA in popular sites still today, and the attacks can be stealth. If you're not, overreaching, they look like regular users failing a login, and there's no lockouts for the end user or anything. Now, password spraying, kind of the flip side of this, where you identify what the username pattern at a given site is, and then you just try common passwords across multiple usernames. So you take one of the 10,000 most popular passwords and then try it on every potential username on that site. These are often going as corporations. And here it again works because people pick terrible passwords and there's no MFA or weak MFA. And even if you have a password policy that requires complexity, that doesn't really help. Password complexity is a crutch that makes it easy for you to feel good about yourself, but it doesn't really help the security because one of our customers told me when they tested their own systems at a password reset point and captured those hashes. They were able to brute force crack them very easily because they found that people were just rotating and adding 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 at the end of their previous password. So it was policy compliant, but actually quite weak. So again, this is why this still works. And then brute force, of course, means that you just run a tool against the website or an API like an email endpoint, and this works for the same exact reasons. Often there's no MFA or weak MFA. So what's the challenge here? The challenge for us is simple. It's like the attacking is asymmetrical. The attackers in this kind of environment have the advantage. It's hard for us to respond to those attacks by blacklisting IP addresses or SSIPs, which are malicious and which are not. Whereas for the attacker, it's easy for them to adjust and change and modify their attacks to stay under the radar. And our job as an industry is to shift that, take that asymmetry out and make this more success for the defense, make it easier for them. So it needs to be harder for the attackers to know that you've detected them and make it harder for them to evade the controls that you have. At the same time, you need to be able to do these things through more automated ways, more quickly than ever before. So obviously, if you think about these identity attacks, then the question is, if it's not that server and it's that user, how are they getting to that user? What is the most targeted service for these different types of attack vectors? And if you think about what are people after, and more often than not, the most targeted service is email, like Office 365. There are several reasons for this, but one of them is that email is really, really old, and it means that you can get to it in many different ways. If you look at a typical deployment, all kinds of legacy applications can access email. And if you talk about those access protocols like PAth3 and IMAP, they all go through basic authentication. Basic authentication is username and password. Even if you had modern MFA deployed to the users, if this path is open, you've got a problem. Because although modern authentication can be secured with that multi-factor authentication, if that basic authentication is open, that means that the attack pathway is open. I live in a house that's built in 1960, and why would I basically, as an attacker who wants to get into my house, go to my front door with fancy locks and real security and cameras and things, when I can just go to the side gate and use, jimmy up the sliding glass door that's been broken since the 70s. And if you look at that, the same thing's happening here. The attackers are going after those legacy endpoints that have no modern authentication. The basic authentication of username and password allows you to do all these attacks that we just talked about. And we see 10 times more authentication, in the data shows that we have 10 times more attacks on those endpoints, the legacy endpoints. So what can we do? What are the best practices? Well, we could just go and start shaming the users and discourage them of using the compromised passwords, which is good. You should do that. There's interesting developments. Chrome now, in the latest version, if you're signed into Chrome, automatically detects compromised passwords. If you're not signed into Chrome for various reasons, you can download our Pass Protect Chrome extension that does the same thing. It securely checks if the password that you're using was compromised in any data breach anywhere. Also, you can increase the end user security awareness and make them participate in their own rescue, if you will. Send them notifications if there's an unidentified device that's logging in, or somebody enrolls into a multi-factor authentication and it wasn't them. It would be good to know. But these are kind of sidetrack in a way. Yeah, it's important that you do this. This can really help. But you should also look at your actual own infrastructure and say, if identity attacks are the leading cause, what are we actually doing to protect against that? And one of the first things you should do is start sunsetting these legacy protocols. Disable POP and IMAP if you have like a cloud-based email system. And then disable basic authentication into that. That way you're forcing the attacks to go to the path where you can put great controls in front of things. So that's an obvious step that you should do. And then what should that authentication factor be? Now, MFA is not MFA, is not MFA. If you have multi-factor authentication using something like SMS one-time passwords, you could argue that it's better than nothing, but only a little bit, right? Because all I need to do at that point, if I want to target an individual, is to go to a swim swap attack. And the cellular carrier becomes the weakest link. And I've tested one myself against myself. It was discouragingly easy to get past that. Now, if you go forward further to the right, beyond software one-time passwords and hardware one-time passwords, into push authentication and security keys and device authenticators, now you have really high assurance. So that's one. MFA can really help, especially if you go to modern authenticators like FIDO2-based authenticators, web authentication now available on all the browser platforms, even on iOS now. You can use things like security keys from Yubico or anyone else, or built-in device authenticators like the Touch ID on a MacBook Pro or Windows Hello authenticator, which all are web authentication authenticators now. So these are great ways to do it. But you also need to start thinking about, hey, should I even allow that authentication event to happen? So this is where we're going now more towards that now granular risk. If I have threat intelligence that tells me that, hey, across all the aggregate authentication data, I can see brute force and password spray attacks, that I can identify these clusters of failed authentications where somebody's clearly enumerating. Then based on that, I can simply block those requests, not even let them into the authentication. And only those ones that are decent, I will even evaluate the sign-on policy. So you should put in systems that allow you to do this. And then going one step further, once you get to that authentication, it can't be binary anymore, where you either knew the password or didn't know the password, yay or nay. That's not enough. You need to analyze and look at the probability that this is unusual. What does it look like this is the real user or not? So if you have a system that allows you to correlate the historical behavior data on what kind of devices the user's been on, how they've acted, what have they done before, and they now take that and say, is this risk high or not? And then if it's high, prompt user for resilient authenticators, like select the right multi-factor authenticator for the situation. And then if the risk is high, you prompt for that FIDO2 WebAuthn authenticator. It's phishing proof for practical purposes. And it means that the attackers are denied and the genuine users get in. And now you can correlate and further enhance that historical data. And even further, this allows you to now get to that point where you're really removing friction from the end user. So you can go to passwordless. Say, what is the risk if I'm on a managed device, if I'm on a recognized device, I'm coming in from where I've always come in from. Why would I even ask for a password? I can just let you write in. And then it could look something like this, where you put in your username and then send a push to my wrist, or tap that Touch ID on my laptop or on my Android phone, and I'm in. So that's the basic idea. All of this enables you to get much better identity-centric security, but at the same time make end users' lives easier by removing friction. Only ask for MFA when it's needed, and do everything based on that contextual risk. So you can take this old broken authentication and pivot yourself and move to this model where you can now go to that zero trust future. And in the context of identity, zero trust really boils down to granting the right people the right level of access to the right resources in the right context and assess that continuously. And this allows you to remove friction, make it easier for the end users. Because if you look at the big picture, it used to be all we knew is what application you're going to and what your credential is. That's it. Binary, yes or no. Now, in this model, we're doing the full context and saying, hey, what IP are you on? Have I seen you here before? What does my threat intelligence say about this IP? Do I see a cluster of attacks? Is it maybe a part of a botnet node that's just enumerating and trying to crack in? Is it coming from a known network anonymizer, Tor exit node, for example? These become data elements that are intelligence. It allows you to say, hey, is it a known device? Have I seen you on this device before? Is this a device that's a corporate device that I'm actually actively managing? What do I know about this endpoint? What is the security state of it? And then the location, where are you coming from? Have I seen you there before? What's normal for you? Are you a traveler like myself that logs in from random airports and hotels around the world? Or are you coming in from the same office every day? And, if I just logged in from Cupertino, California, and 5 minutes later I'm logging in from Mumbai, one of those two isn't me. All this gives you ability to now say, what is the actual risk? And then based on that, prompt for the right sized factor. What is the right authenticator? And allow or deny access based on that. So it brings us to kind of like the idea, what is the architecture going to look like for this kind of a security model then? If I'm going away from that purely perimeter-based security, I need to look at the identity of the user and the identity of their devices. I need to go and look at the context of that, the user themselves, the device context, the location context, the network context, the application context, and enrich that with third-party data if I already invested in something else, like email security. Shouldn't I take advantage of that and take the attack vectors that I know and then put those people who are attacked into a different security posture automatically? Or, for example, if I have some information about the application context, if I have CASBs or UBA tools that give me context, let's take all that into account and then make that risk-based access control policy decision. Then authorize the access to whatever that resource is. So this takes us to the modern world. Now you can control not just that cloud-based application, but by using things like on-premise hardware infrastructure that you may have, like F5 appliances, or put in virtual appliances that act as essentially access gateway proxies. And you can now control access to not only the cloud-oriented modern apps, but also traditional on-premise apps where you have no access or no ability to modify that application in any way. All of a sudden, you can take a very modern security approach and apply it to all kinds of application categories. And you can take that beyond that and go into that infrastructure, like access to servers, your CI/CD pipeline, your tooling that you use to stand up your infrastructure. All that should be protected that same way. And all that information needs to be then flowing downstream to your security operations. So if you have a security operations team that's using a SIEM or a UBA platform and you're analyzing the data, all these identity events are gold. They're really valuable. It's rich data with a lot of context. You know not only a timestamp and an IP address, you have all kinds of contextual data you can grab. You know the device type, you can capture, device fingerprinting information. You can correlate across all kinds of vectors. And then that information can come back the other way and say, hey, if I see something unusual and I flag it, I can put that user into a penalty box. I can take that user and put him in a different security group while I'm investigating. So it's a two-way street. So people often then, look at this and go like, oh, great, I have to throw everything away that I've invested in. But that doesn't necessarily be the case. You can look at it from the perspective of maturity model and look at everything that you're already invested in. And we basically did this survey and found across that there were a lot of different assets that people already have and projects that they're engaging in that all can be building blocks. And we built this kind of a maturity model. And if you're interested in this, I encourage you to come and take a look at more information on our website at Okta. But basically, you can take all of these traditionally IT-oriented tooling that you have and start pivoting them towards that security outcome. And if you have any questions on this, feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to answer any of your questions. So with that, I hope that you found this useful. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.